My name is Celeste Tobido, though was not the name my grandmother gave me when I first drew breath in the Louisiana swamplands in the year 1820. The white man who claimed to own me called me property, called me chattel, called me whatever name suited his convenience. But the spirits always knew my true name, Iangoy, daughter of the crossroads, keeper of the old ways my people carried across the dark waters from Guinea and Congo, from places where power flowed through blood and bone and sacred knowledge that no chain could bind. I tell you this story now because the time has come to speak the truth about what happened at Magnolia Bend Plantation in the autumn of 1856, when I called upon powers older than slavery and darker than the Bionites to bring justice to those who believed their white skin and their money made them immune to the laws that govern all living things. What I did to the Tobido family was not done out of hatred, though hatred lived in my heart like a coal that never cooled. It was done in the name of balance, in service to forces that demand payment for every cruelty, every life destroyed, every spirit broken in the service of profit and pride. Master August Tobido thought he owned me body and soul when he bought me at the New Orleans slave market in 1845. But he was wrong about the soul part. My soul belonged to the Loa, the spirits who had protected my bloodline through generations of suffering, the ancient ones who remember every injustice and exact payment in their own time and their own way. I was 25 years old when I came to Magnolia Bend, already trained in the mysteries by my grandmother before the yellow fever took her, already carrying in my blood the power that would eventually destroy everyone who thought they could break me. The Tobido family lived in a grand mansion overlooking the Mississippi River, surrounded by sugarcane fields worked by 300 souls who had been stolen from Africa or born into bondage on American soil. August was a man who took pleasure in cruelty, who found entertainment in the suffering of others, and who had convinced himself that his wealth and social position made him a god among the people he claimed to own. His wife Marguerite was a woman of French aristocracy who had been raised to believe enslaved people were a different species entirely, creatures that existed solely to serve her comfort and convenience. Their children, Claude, their eldest son, and their daughter Marie-Claire, had been raised in this same poisonous belief, taught from infancy that their pale skin gave them the right to command and abuse anyone whose skin was darker than their own. They had grown into young adults who wore their cruelty like fashionable clothing, competing with each other to see who could devise the most creative forms of torture for the enslaved people forced to attend to their every whim. I was assigned to work in the main house, tending to the family's personal needs, cleaning their rooms and serving their meals, while listening to their casual discussions of which slaves to sell, which ones to breed, and which ones to punish for imagined infractions. My position gave me intimate access to their lives, their routines, their fears, and their weaknesses. Knowledge that I stored away like seeds, waiting for the proper season to sprout into something terrible and just. But it was not their casual cruelty that finally drove me to call upon the old powers for vengeance. It was what they did to my daughter Zara that crossed the line between ordinary evil and the kind of abomination that demands supernatural justice. Zara was 16 years old in the summer of 1856, beautiful and intelligent, and filled with the kind of spirit that no amount of bondage had been able to crush. She had inherited my gift for seeing beyond the veil that separates the world of the living from the realm of the spirits. And I had been teaching her the old ways in secret, passing down the knowledge that had been passed down to me by my grandmother and her grandmother before her. The trouble began when Claude Tobido, now 22, and already showing signs of the same sadistic nature that characterized his father, decided that Zara would make an interesting addition to his collection of enslaved women who were forced to satisfy his sexual appetites. When she refused his advances, he had her whipped in front of the entire household as punishment for her insolence. When she continued to resist, he escalated his attacks until what began as attempted rape became something far worse. On the night of August 15, 1856, Claude Tobido beat my daughter to death with his bare hands because she would not stop fighting him. Because even faced with certain death, she refused to surrender her dignity to a man who believed her body belonged to him by right of his white skin and his father's money. He left her broken corpse in the slave quarters like discarded garbage, then complained to his father that he had been forced to discipline an unruly slave who had threatened his safety. I held my daughter's lifeless body in my arms that night and felt something inside me transform into something harder and colder than the bottom of the Mississippi River. The grief I carried was beyond words, beyond tears, beyond any emotion that had a name in the language of ordinary human experience. It was the kind of pain that opens doorways to places where the old gods wait for those desperate enough to pay the price they demand for their intervention. 3 days after Zara's murder, I began the rituals that would bring the power of the ancestors down upon the Tobido family like a curse, that would follow them into their graves and beyond. I gathered the items I would need from the swamplands around the plantation graveyard dirt, from the oldest cemetery in New Orleans, Spanish moss that had been struck by lightning, water from 7 different bayous, and the blood of a black rooster killed at the crossroads under a new moon. But the most important ingredient was something that came from within myself, the rage of a mother whose child had been murdered by the very people who claimed to own them both. That rage was pure and clean and powerful, enough to call down forces that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid. Forces that to those who've been pushed beyond the breaking point and who are willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to balance the scales of justice. The first ritual took place in the slave cemetery behind the plantation, where generations of my people had been buried in unmarked graves after lives spent in service to the Tobido family's prosperity. I called upon the spirits of the dead to bear witness to the injustice that had been done to my daughter, to add their voices to mine in demanding payment from those who had profited from their suffering. The response was immediate and terrifying. The air around the cemetery grew cold despite the August heat, and shadows began moving between the grave markers, even though there was no wind to stir the moss that hung from the cypress trees. I could feel the presence of the ancestors gathering around me, their anger and pain flowing through me like electricity, giving me the power I needed to work magic that would reach across the veil between worlds and touch the lives of those who had wronged us. Over the following weeks, I performed 7 more rituals, each one designed to target a different aspect of the Tobido family's life and happiness. I cursed their health, their wealth, their sanity, their relationships, and their ability to find peace in this world or the next. I called upon Baron Samedi to open the gates of death for them, upon Erzeli Danter to turn their love into hatred, upon Legba to close all the roads that might lead them to salvation. But the most powerful curse was the one I saved for last, the one that would ensure that the Tobido family's suffering would be as complete and devastating as they had made mine. I cursed their bloodline itself, calling down madness and misfortune upon their children and their children's children, ensuring that the evil they had done would follow them through generations like a poison that could never be purged from their family tree. The spirits heard my prayers and answered them with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. Within a month of beginning my workings, the first signs of the curse began to manifest in ways that terrified the family and everyone who witnessed their decline. August began experiencing nightmares so vivid and disturbing that he stopped sleeping entirely, wandering the halls of the mansion at night, like a ghost haunting his own home. Marguerite developed a skin condition that covered her face and hands with lesions that no doctor could explain or treat, making her too ashamed to leave her room or receive visitors. But it was Claude who suffered the most spectacular consequences of my magical intervention, because the spirits understood that he was the one who had committed the crime that demanded the harshest punishment. He began seeing Zara's ghost everywhere he went, in mirrors, in shadows, in the corners of rooms, where she would stand watching him with eyes that burned with accusations he could not escape. The visions drove him to drink, and the drink drove him to violence, and the violence drove him to acts of increasing madness that horrified even his own family. The curse was working exactly as I had designed it to work, and I watched the destruction of the Voodoo family with the same cold satisfaction that they had shown when they destroyed the lives of the people they enslaved. The old gods had heard my prayer for justice, and they were delivering it with the kind of precision and completeness that only supernatural forces could achieve. But this was only the beginning of what I had called down upon them. The spirits were just getting started with their work, and before they were finished, the Voodoo family would understand exactly what it felt like to be powerless in the face of forces beyond their control or comprehension. They had sown the wind with their cruelty, and now they were going to reap the whirlwind that I had summoned from the depths of the bayou and the wisdom of my ancestors. The change in the atmosphere at Magnolia Bend was immediate and unmistakable to anyone who possessed the sensitivity to perceive the movement of spiritual forces through the physical world. The very air seemed heavier after I completed my first rituals, charged with an energy that made the enslaved people nervous and skittish, while driving the white family toward a state of increasing agitation that they could not understand or explain. I continued my duties in the main house as if nothing had changed, serving meals and cleaning rooms while observing the early effects of my workings with the detached interest of a gardener watching seeds sprout in carefully prepared soil. The spirits were beginning their work with the subtle precision that characterized their interventions in human affairs, applying pressure to weak points in the family's psychological and physical structures that would eventually cause complete collapse. August's insomnia grew worse with each passing night, transforming him from the confident plantation master who had ruled his domain with absolute authority into a hollow-eyed ghost who jumped at shadows and spoke to people who were not there. He began seeing enslaved people who had died years earlier, workers who had been killed by overwork or punishment or disease. And they would stand at the foot of his bed, pointing accusing fingers at him while speaking in voices that sounded like wind through Spanish moss. "Do you see them too, Celeste?" he asked me one morning as I served his breakfast, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely hold his coffee cup. "The dead ones standing in the corners watching everything we do. They're angry about something, but I can't understand what they want from me." I kept my expression neutral and concerned, playing the role of the loyal servant who was worried about her master's health, rather than the priestess who had summoned those very spirits to torment him. "I don't see nothing unusual, Master August," I replied softly. Maybe you should talk to the doctor about getting something to help you sleep better. Sometimes when a person gets overtired, their mind starts playing tricks on them. But August had moved beyond the reach of doctors or medicines, because what afflicted him was not a disease of the body, but a spiritual contamination that would grow stronger with each passing day until it consumed him entirely. The ancestors were patient but relentless in their pursuit of justice, and they would not be satisfied with anything less than the complete destruction of the man who had profited from their suffering and death. Marguerite's condition was equally disturbing, but manifested in different ways that reflected the specific nature of her crimes against the people she had enslaved. The lesions that had appeared on her skin began to spread and multiply, covering her arms and neck with sores that wept constantly and smelled like decay despite all attempts at treatment. But worse than the physical symptoms was the mental deterioration that accompanied them, as she began to lose her ability to recognize people and places that had been familiar to her for decades. "Who are you?" she asked me one afternoon as I cleaned her room, looking at me with the confusion of someone who had awakened in a foreign country where nothing made sense. "You look familiar, but I can't remember where I've seen you before. Are you one of the new girls? Did my husband buy you at the market in New Orleans?" I had been serving her daily for 11 years, had dressed her hair and helped her into her clothes, and listened to her complaints about everything from the weather to the behavior of her children. But the curse was systematically erasing those memories along with everything else that had once given structure and meaning to her life. The spirits were unraveling her mind thread by thread, leaving her with nothing but confusion and fear in a world that no longer made sense to her. But it was Claude who provided the most dramatic evidence of my curse's effectiveness, because his guilt over murdering Zara had created a weakness that the spirits could exploit with devastating efficiency. The visions that plagued him grew more frequent and more vivid with each passing day, until he could no longer distinguish between reality and the supernatural persecution that I had called down upon him. He began carrying a pistol at all times, claiming that he needed protection from the ghost girl who followed him everywhere he went. He would fire shots at empty corners and vacant doorways, shouting at Zara's spirit to leave him alone, while servants and family members watched in horror as their young master descended into obvious madness. "She's there!" he would scream, pointing at nothing while his eyes rolled white with terror. "Can't you see her? She's covered in blood, and she's reaching for me with her dead hands. Make her stop, please. Somebody make her stop following me." The other enslaved people on the plantation began to whisper among themselves about the strange changes affecting the white family, and many of them suspected that supernatural forces were at work, even if they didn't understand the source of those forces. Some of them had heard stories about Voodoo and Hoodoo from relatives who had come from Haiti or New Orleans, and they recognized the signs of a curse that had been professionally applied by someone with real power. Something's got hold of that family, I heard Old Baptist tell a group of field hands one evening as they gathered around the fire outside their quarters. "Something dark and angry that ain't going to be satisfied until it's finished with all of them. Mark my words, this plantation's going to be a very different place before whatever's happening here runs its course." He was more right than he knew, because I was just getting started with the spiritual assault that I had planned for the Tobido family. The early symptoms they were experiencing were merely the foundation for more severe manifestations that would follow as the curse gained momentum and the spirits grew more comfortable. working through the channels I had opened for them. The second phase of my workings began during the dark of the moon in September, when the veil between worlds was thinnest and the power of the ancestors could flow most freely into the realm of the living. I performed a ritual in the swamplands behind the plantation that called upon Baron La Croix to open the gates of the cemetery and send forth an army of the restless dead to plague the dreams and waking hours of everyone who lived in the main house. This ritual required more dangerous ingredients than my previous workings, including dirt from the grave of a murderer, water from a drowning place, and the dried blood of a woman who had died in childbirth. But the most important component was a photograph of Zara that I had stolen from Claude's room, where he had kept it as a trophy of his crime, not understanding that possessing an image of his victim would create a direct spiritual connection that I could use to channel her vengeance. I burned the photograph in a fire made from wood taken from a gallows tree, mixing the ashes with graveyard dirt and other materials to create a powder that I spread around the foundation of the main house under cover of darkness. This powder would serve as a spiritual minefield that would explode with supernatural energy every time one of the family members crossed it, bombarding them with the accumulated rage and pain of everyone who had died in service to their greed and cruelty. The effects were immediate and spectacular. August's nightmares became so intense that his screams could be heard throughout the plantation, waking enslaved families in quarters that were hundreds of yards away from the main house. Marguerite began sleepwalking, wandering through the house at night, while speaking in languages that no one recognized, holding conversations with invisible companions who seemed to be giving her instructions that she followed with the mindless obedience of a person under hypnosis. But Claude's suffering reached new levels of intensity that satisfied my hunger for justice, while demonstrating the terrible power of spiritual forces when properly directed by someone who understands how to work with them. He began experiencing what he described as waking nightmares, where Zara's ghost would appear to him during broad daylight, sometimes alone and sometimes accompanied by other spirits of enslaved people who had died on the plantation over the years. These supernatural visitations were not passive haunting experiences, but active attacks that left physical marks on Claude's body. Scratches that appeared on his skin without explanation, bruises that formed in the shape of handprints, and wounds that opened and closed according to patterns that corresponded to the injuries that had been inflicted on the people whose spirits were tormenting him. "They're trying to kill me," he confided to his father during one of their increasingly rare conversations, his voice hoarse from screaming and his eyes wild with the desperation of someone who had been pushed to the very edge of sanity. "The dead slaves. They want revenge for whatever we did to them. And they're using that girl's ghost as their leader. She tells them what to do, and they do it. And every night, there are more of them than there were the night before." August listened to his son's ravings with growing horror, not because he believed in ghosts or curses, but because he could see that Claude was losing his mind in ways that might be irreversible. The Tibito family's reputation in Louisiana society depended on maintaining an appearance of respectability and sanity, and Claude's obvious mental deterioration threatened to destroy everything that August had spent his life building. "Perhaps we should send you away for a while," August suggested, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying not to panic. "A trip to Europe, maybe, or a stay with your cousins in Charleston. Sometimes a change of scenery can help with problems like this." But Claude shook his head violently, his eyes darting toward corners of the room where I knew Zara's spirit was standing, even though I could not see her myself. "She'll follow me wherever I go," he whispered. "She told me so. She said she's going to follow me until I'm dead, and then she's going to follow me into hell and make sure I suffer there for eternity." The spirits were doing their work with an enthusiasm that exceeded even my expectations, applying pressure to the Tibito family's weakest points, while gradually escalating their campaign of supernatural terrorism. But this was still only the beginning of what I had planned for them, because the most devastating aspects of my curse were yet to manifest in ways that would destroy not just their sanity, but their wealth, their social position, and ultimately their lives. The third phase of my workings would target the foundation of their power, the plantation itself, and the financial empire that August had built on the backs of enslaved people like myself and my murdered daughter. When the spirits finished with Magnolia Bend, there would be nothing left but ruins and memories of what happened when the powerless found ways to strike back at those who had tormented them beyond endurance. By October of AFIF, the curse had taken such firm hold of the Tibito family that even the other white families in the parish began to notice that something was seriously wrong at Magnolia Bend. The invitations to social gatherings that had once flowed freely to the plantation stopped coming, and the visits from neighbors and business associates that had been a regular part of August's social calendar dwindled to nothing as word spread about the family's increasingly bizarre behavior. The financial implications of this social isolation were immediate and severe, because August's business dealings had always depended on the network of relationships he had cultivated among Louisiana's planter elite. Cotton and sugar factors who had once competed for his business began avoiding him, unwilling to associate their firms with a man whose son was known to fire pistols at invisible enemies, and whose wife had been seen wandering through New Orleans in her nightgown, speaking to shadows in what sounded like African languages. I watched this social and economic collapse with the satisfaction of someone who had planned every aspect of the destruction she was witnessing. The spirits were working with precision and creativity that exceeded anything I had dared to hope for when I first called upon them for assistance. They understood that true revenge required more than just driving the family insane. It required destroying their ability to maintain the lifestyle that had been built on the suffering of enslaved people. The third phase of my workings had been designed to target the plantation's productivity and profitability, and the spirits embraced this mission with an enthusiasm that manifested in ways both subtle and dramatic. The sugar cane that had always grown abundantly in the rich soil along the Mississippi River began to wither and die despite perfect weather conditions, as if the earth itself was rejecting the crops that had been planted by enslaved hands for the profit of their oppressors. The machinery that processed the cane into sugar began breaking down with mysterious regularity, suffering mechanical failures that the plantation's engineers could not explain or prevent. Boilers exploded without warning, grinding stones cracked along invisible fault lines, and the complex system of pumps and channels that controlled water flow throughout the plantation developed leaks that seemed to repair themselves during the day, only to reopen each night when the moon rose. But the most disturbing manifestation of the curse's effect on the plantation's operations was what happened to the enslaved workers themselves. Many of them began experiencing what they described as visitations from family members who had died on the plantation over the years, spirits who came to them in dreams with messages about uprising and resistance that were unlike anything that had been attempted at Magnolia Bend before. These spiritual messages were coordinated and consistent in ways that suggested they were being directed by an intelligence that understood both the practical and psychological aspects of rebellion. The spirits were not simply encouraging random acts of violence or sabotage, but rather organizing a systematic campaign of resistance that would cripple the plantation's operations while protecting the enslaved workers from the kind of brutal retaliation that had historically followed unsuccessful uprisings. Work slowdowns began throughout the plantation, with field hands and house servants alike discovering creative ways to reduce their productivity without triggering punishments that might escalate into violence. Tools disappeared at crucial moments. Livestock wandered away from their enclosures, and the careful schedules that governed plantation life began to break down as workers claimed to be receiving contradictory instructions from spirits that only they could see and hear. August's attempts to restore discipline through traditional methods of punishment and intimidation proved completely ineffective because the enslaved workers were now being guided by forces that existed beyond his ability to threaten or control. When he ordered whippings for workers who claimed to be following orders from dead relatives, the spirits responded by inflicting similar injuries on members of his own family, creating a clear pattern of supernatural retaliation that even the most skeptical observers could not dismiss as coincidence. The slaves are turning against us, August confided to his wife during one of her increasingly rare moments of lucidity, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who could feel his world collapsing around him, but could not understand why. They claim they're being told what to do by spirits, by dead people who want them to destroy everything we've built here. But how do you fight enemies you can't see? How do you punish people for following orders from ghosts? Marguerite's response revealed the extent to which the curse had damaged her mind and memory as she looked at her husband with the confusion of someone who was no longer certain about basic facts of her own existence. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice carrying the lost quality of a child who had awakened in a strange place. "Are you my father? You look familiar, but I can't remember where I've seen you before. And who are these slaves you're talking about? Do we own slaves? I thought slavery was something that happened in other places, not here." The conversation that followed was heartbreaking to witness, even for someone like me, who had every reason to hate the woman who was slowly disappearing into the fog of supernatural dementia. August tried desperately to remind his wife of their shared history, their children, their life together on the plantation. But the spirits had systematically erased these memories along with her ability to form new ones, leaving her trapped in a perpetual present that contained no reference points or familiar landmarks. Claude's condition had progressed to the point where he could no longer function as a member of the family or society, spending his days and nights in a state of constant terror as Zara's ghost and her supernatural allies subjected him to torments that grew more creative and more severe with each passing week. He had stopped eating regular meals, claiming that the dead girl appeared whenever he tried to consume food and would show him visions of her own decaying corpse until he vomited from revulsion and horror. His attempts to escape the plantation and the supernatural persecution that plagued him there had been frustrated by the spirit's ability to follow him wherever he went, manifesting in hotel rooms and social clubs, and even churches with the same relentless intensity that characterized their appearances at Magnolia Bend. He had returned from his last trip to New Orleans in a state of complete psychological collapse, babbling about dead slaves who had surrounded his carriage and spoken to him in unison about crimes that demanded payment. She's getting stronger. He told me one morning when I brought breakfast to his room, his eyes fixed on a corner where I knew Zara's spirit was standing, even though I could not see her myself. Every day she gets more solid, more real, and every day there are more of them with her. They're planning something, Celeste. They're planning something terrible. And they're going to use her to do it, because she hates me more than all the others combined. I maintained my expression of concerned sympathy, while internally marveling at the accuracy of his perception, because the spirits were indeed planning something that would serve as the culmination of everything I had set in motion through my rituals and curses. The final phase of my workings would bring the full power of the ancestors to bear against the Voodoo family in ways that would ensure their complete destruction, while serving as a warning to anyone else who might consider treating enslaved people as less than human. The financial pressure created by the plantation's declining productivity had forced August to consider selling some of his enslaved workers to raise the cash needed to meet his obligations to creditors and business partners. This decision would trigger the final sequence of events that I had woven into my curse, because the spirits had made it clear that any attempt to separate families or sell people away from Magnolia Bend would result in consequences that would exceed anything the family had experienced so far. I had been waiting for August to make this decision, knowing that his arrogance and greed would eventually force him to repeat the same pattern of cruelty that had led to Zara's death, and my decision to call upon the old powers for justice. When that moment came, the spirits would respond with violence that would make their previous interventions seem gentle by comparison, because the time for subtle psychological pressure was ending, and the time for direct action was about to begin. The fourth phase of my workings would demonstrate to the Voodoo family and everyone who witnessed their fate that there were forces in the world that could not be controlled or defeated by wealth and social position. Forces that answered only to the demands of justice, or the cries of the oppressed for vengeance oppressors. Their oppressors. The ancestors were gathering their strength for one final assault that would leave no doubt about the price of treating human beings as property. The plague of madness and misfortune that had been spreading through Magnolia Bend was about to reach its climax, and when it did, the Voodoo family would learn what it meant to face the full wrath of spirits who had been waiting generations for the opportunity to balance the scales of justice in favor of those who had suffered under the weight of slavery and exploitation. The moment I had been waiting for arrived on November 15, 1856, when August's mounting financial pressures finally forced him to make the decision that would trigger the final phase of my curse. Standing in his study with papers scattered across his desk, like leaves after a storm, he called me to bring him coffee while he calculated which of his enslaved workers he could afford to sell to raise the money needed to satisfy his most urgent creditors. Celeste, he said without looking up from his ledger books, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing livestock rather than human beings. I need you to prepare a list of the younger field hands, the ones who would bring good prices at the New Orleans market. I'll have to sell off some of my property to cover these debts, and slaves are more liquid than land right now. As I set his coffee cup on the desk, I felt the spiritual temperature in the room drop so suddenly that my breath became visible in the air, and I knew that the ancestors were responding to his words with anger that would soon manifest in ways that would terrify him beyond his capacity to endure. The spirits had been waiting for this moment. The repetition of the same callous cruelty that had led to Zara's murder, and my decision to call upon powers that most people feared to name. "Yes, Master August," I replied. My voice steadied despite the electrical energy that was building in the space around us as unseen forces gathered for the final assault on his sanity and his life. "How many names would you like on that list?" 20 should be sufficient, he said, still focused on his calculations rather than the supernatural storm that was brewing in response to his words. "Choose the strongest and healthiest ones, the ones without families to complicate the sales. I need cash quickly, and I can't afford to waste time on sentimental considerations." That phrase, sentimental considerations, was the match that lit the fuse leading to the spiritual dynamite that I had been placing around the foundation of his world for months. The ancestors understood that August was planning to repeat the same pattern that had destroyed my family, breaking apart enslaved families for profit, while dismissing their pain as irrelevant to his financial needs. The response was immediate and terrifying in its intensity. The temperature in the study plummeted until frost began forming on the windows, despite the mild November weather outside, and shadows began moving across the walls with purpose and intelligence that had nothing to do with the flames flickering in the fireplace. August looked up from his papers with confusion that quickly transformed into fear as he realized that something supernatural was happening in his own home. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, as he watched the shadows on the walls coalesce into recognizable human forms. The spirits of enslaved people who had died on his plantation over the decades, all of them returning at once to witness and participate in the justice that was about to be administered. "Celeste, what's happening to my study?" I stepped back toward the door, not because I feared the spirits, but because I understood that what was about to occur would be more terrible than anything August had the capacity to survive with his sanity intact. The ancestors were done with subtle psychological pressure and gradual deterioration. They were ready to deliver justice with the kind of dramatic finality that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider treating human beings as disposable property. "They've come for you, Master August," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for forces beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals. "The spirits of everyone who died to make you rich, everyone you sold away from their families, everyone you worked to death in your fields. They've been waiting a long time for this moment, and now they're ready to collect what you owe them." The spiritual assault that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed during all my years of working with the old powers. The ghosts that materialized in August's study were not the vague, translucent figures that usually appeared during supernatural encounters, but solid, substantial beings who moved with purpose and coordination, that spoke of intelligence and organization that transcended death itself. They surrounded August's desk, like a court convening to render judgment, their eyes burning with the accumulated rage of generations spent in bondage, while their voices rose in harmonious accusation that seemed to come from the very walls of the room. Some of them I recognized. Field hands who had died from overwork, house servants who had been beaten to death for minor infractions, children who had been sold away from their parents and had died of grief in distant places. But at the center of this supernatural tribunal stood Zara, my daughter, looking exactly as she had in life but radiating power that made the air around her shimmer with energy that was both beautiful and terrible. Her eyes were fixed on August with an intensity that seemed to pin him to his chair like an insect mounted for scientific study. And when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had passed beyond the reach of earthly laws and had returned to enforce cosmic justice. "August Tibido," she said, her words resonating through dimensions that existed beyond the physical world. "You have been judged by those you wronged, and you have been found guilty of crimes against the sacred order that connects all living things. The sentence is madness, ruin, and death, to be carried out immediately and without possibility of appeal or mercy." August's scream when he heard this pronouncement was the sound of a human mind shattering under pressure that it was never designed to withstand. He tried to run from the room, but the spirits moved to block his path, their forms becoming more solid and more threatening as his terror increased. When he attempted to call for help, his voice emerged as nothing more than a hoarse whisper that carried no further than the walls of his study. The final phase of his psychological destruction came when Zara showed him visions of every cruel act he had committed during his years as a plantation owner, forcing him to experience each incident from the perspective of his victims, rather than from his position of power and privilege. He was made to feel the pain of every whipping he had ordered, the grief of every family he had separated, the despair of every person he had worked to death in service to his greed and ambition. But the spirit's justice extended beyond August to encompass his entire family, because the curse I had crafted was designed to punish not just the primary perpetrator, but everyone who had benefited from and participated in the system that made such cruelty possible. Claude and Marguerite were experiencing their own supernatural reckonings in other parts of the house, confronted by spirits who had specific grievances against them and who were delivering personalized forms of cosmic justice. Claude's encounter with the ancestors was particularly brutal, because his crime against Zara had been the trigger that set everything in motion. The spirits who surrounded him in his bedroom were all women who had been sexually assaulted by him over the years. Enslaved women who had been powerless to resist his advances, but who now returned with supernatural strength to exact payment for the violence he had inflicted upon them. Zara led this group of vengeful spirits, her presence commanding and terrible, as she orchestrated a form of justice that matched the severity of the crimes that had been committed against her and her sisters in bondage. Claude's screams echoed through the mansion as the dead women subjected him to the same helplessness and terror that he had forced upon them, showing him what it felt like to be powerless in the face of overwhelming force. Meanwhile, Marguerite faced her own supernatural tribunal composed of the children who had been separated from their families during her years as mistress of the plantation. These small spirits surrounded her with accusations that cut through the fog of dementia that had been protecting her from the full weight of her guilt, forcing her to remember and acknowledge every callous decision she had made regarding the enslaved families under her control. The spiritual assault continued throughout the night, with the intensity building toward a climax that would either destroy the Tibido family entirely or drive them so far into madness that they would never again be capable of harming anyone else. The ancestors were thorough in their administration of justice, ensuring that every crime was addressed and every victim was given the opportunity to confront their oppressor in circumstances where the usual power dynamics had been completely reversed. As dawn approached, the spirits began to withdraw from the physical realm, but not before delivering their final message to the surviving members of the Tibido family. Through Zara, they pronounced a curse that would follow the bloodline through generations, ensuring that the consequences of their cruelty would be visited upon their descendants until the last member of their family line had paid the full price for the suffering they had caused. Let this house stand as a monument to what happens when the powerful abuse the powerless," Zara declared, her voice carrying across the plantation with supernatural force that reached every enslaved person in the quarters. Let the name Tibeto become a warning to those who would profit from human misery, and let our justice echo through the generations until the scales are finally balanced. When the sun rose on November 16, 1856, Magnolia Bend Plantation had been transformed into something resembling a battlefield where the casualties were not bodies, but minds and souls that had been shattered by forces beyond human comprehension. August was found in his study, alive but completely catatonic, his eyes staring at something that no living person could see, while his mouth moved silently as if he were trying to speak words that would never come. Claude had suffered a complete mental breakdown that left him in a state of gibbering madness, convinced that he was being constantly pursued by dead women who wanted to drag him down to hell for his crimes against them. He would spend the rest of his brief life in an asylum in New Orleans, where he died less than a year later from injuries sustained during one of his violent fits of terror. Marguerite's condition was perhaps the most tragic, because the spirits had restored her memory, just long enough for her to understand the full scope of what she had done and what was being done to her family in return. The weight of this knowledge, combined with the supernatural dementia that continued to eat away at her mind, left her in a state of constant anguish that would persist until her death 3 years later. The plantation itself began to deteriorate with supernatural speed, as if the curse had infected not just the family, but the very land that had been watered with the blood and tears of enslaved people for generations. The crops failed completely. The machinery broke down beyond repair, and the enslaved workers were eventually sold off to pay creditors who descended like vultures on the ruins of the Tibeto fortune. I remained at Magnolia Bend until the final sale was completed, watching with satisfaction as everything that had been built on the suffering of my people crumbled into dust and ruin. The spirits had delivered justice more complete and terrible than anything I had dared to hope for when I first called upon them for assistance, proving that there were forces in the universe that could not be bribed, threatened, or bought off by those who thought their wealth made them immune to consequences. On the day I was sold to a new master in Mississippi, I took one last look at the ruins of the Tibeto mansion and felt the presence of my daughter's spirit standing beside me, her supernatural form shimmering in the Louisiana sunlight, like heat rising from summer pavement. She had found peace in the completion of her vengeance, and I had found redemption in serving as the instrument through which cosmic justice had been administered to those who deserved it. The curse I had placed on the Tibeto bloodline would continue to work its way through future generations, ensuring that the evil they had done would never be forgotten or forgiven by the spiritual forces that govern the moral order of the universe. Their name would become synonymous with the price of cruelty, and their fate would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider treating human beings as property to be bought and sold at will. As my new master's wagon carried me away from Magnolia Bend for the last time, I heard the wind through the Spanish moss, carrying the voices of the ancestors singing songs of victory and justice. Songs that would echo through the base of Louisiana for as long as the people remembered the story of what happened when the power of heaven and hell upon to help on those who had tormented them beyond endurance. 25 years have passed since that November night when the spirits of my ancestors delivered justice to the Tibeto family with a thoroughness that exceeded even my most vengeful dreams. And I am writing these words in the knowledge that my own time in this world is drawing to a close. The cancer that grows in my belly will soon carry me to the realm where Zara waits with all the others who have gone before. But before I join them, I must record the full truth about what happened at Magnolia Bend and the consequences that have followed the curse I placed upon that family line. The immediate aftermath of the supernatural assault on the Tibito family became legendary throughout Louisiana's parishes, passed down through generations of enslaved people and their descendants as proof that the old powers still protected those who knew how to call upon them properly. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details and embellishments that sometimes obscured the truth, but never diminished the essential message, that there were forces in the world that could not be controlled by white skin and money, and that justice delayed was not always justice denied. I was sold to a cotton planter named Jeremiah Morrison, who owned a smaller but more humane operation in Mississippi, where I spent the final years of my enslavement, working as a midwife and healer for the enslaved community on his plantation. My reputation as someone who possessed supernatural power had followed me from Louisiana, and while I never again called upon the ancestors for vengeance on the scale of what I had done to the Tibito family, I continued to practice the old ways in service to my people's needs for healing, protection, and spiritual guidance. The war that finally came in 1861 brought freedom to all of us who had been held in bondage, but it also brought its own forms of suffering and chaos that tested our ability to survive in a world where the old certainties had been swept away. I used the knowledge I had gained during my years of enslavement to help former slaves navigate the challenges of freedom, teaching them how to protect themselves from spiritual and physical dangers while honoring the ancestors who had made their liberation possible. But my most important work during the post-war years involved tracking the effects of the curse I had placed on the Tibito bloodline, documenting how it continued to manifest in the lives of the family's descendants, and ensuring that the spiritual justice I had set in motion remained active and effective across generations. The ancestors had promised that their vengeance would follow the family line until every debt had been paid, and they proved remarkably faithful to that promise. August Tibito died in the New Orleans asylum where he had been confined after his complete mental breakdown, his body finally giving out under the strain of supernatural terror that had consumed his mind for 3 years. His death was officially attributed to heart failure, but the asylum staff whispered among themselves about the way he had screamed about dead slaves coming for him, right up until his final breath, about how his eyes had tracked invisible figures moving around his room, even when he was too weak to speak. Claude had preceded his father into death by 2 years, dying in the same asylum after a violent fit that left him with injuries so severe that even the doctors who were accustomed to dealing with the self-destructive behavior of the insane were shocked by what he had done to himself. The attending physician reported that Claude had somehow managed to inflict wounds on his own body that perfectly matched the injuries that had killed Zara, as if he had been forced to experience her death from the victim's perspective. Marguerite survived the longest of the original family, lingering in a state of supernatural dementia that kept her trapped between memory and madness until her death in 1859. Her final years were spent in the care of distant relatives who had taken her in more from duty than love, and she died calling out for people who had been dead for decades, begging forgiveness from enslaved children whose names she had forgotten during her years of comfortable cruelty, but whom her tortured mind now remembered with perfect clarity. But the curse did not end with the deaths of the primary targets, because I had specifically crafted it to follow the bloodline through future generations, ensuring that the children and grandchildren of the Tibito family would continue to pay for the sins of their ancestors. Marie Claire, the daughter who had escaped the initial supernatural assault by being away at school in Charleston during the worst of the family's ordeal, returned to Louisiana to claim what remained of her inheritance, only to discover that the curse had been waiting patiently for her arrival. She married a banker from New Orleans named Philip Durand in 1858, hoping to rebuild the family fortune through careful investment and social connections. But the spiritual forces I had unleashed proved capable of adapting to new circumstances and new targets. Within a year of their marriage, Philip began experiencing the same supernatural harassment that had destroyed Marie Claire's family, seeing spirits in their home and suffering from nightmares so vivid that he stopped sleeping entirely. Their children, when they came, were born under the shadow of the curse and grew up surrounded by supernatural phenomena that marked them as targets of ancestral justice that would not be satisfied until the last member of the bloodline paid for the accumulated crimes of their family. Some died in infancy from mysterious illnesses that no doctor could diagnose or treat, while others survived to adulthood only to face lives marked by madness, addiction, and the kind of spectacular failures that seemed to confirm the presence of supernatural forces working against them. The financial ruin that had begun with August's gambling debts and the collapse of Magnolia Bend continued to plague the family's descendants, as every business venture they attempted was sabotaged by circumstances that defied rational explanation. Investments that should have been profitable collapsed without warning. Partnerships dissolved amid accusations and recriminations that seemed to arise from nowhere, and properties owned by family members were destroyed by fires, floods, and other natural disasters that struck with suspicious timing and devastating efficiency. But the most satisfying aspect of the curse's continued operation was the way it preserved and transmitted the memory of what the original Tibito family had done to deserve their supernatural punishment. Each new generation learned about their ancestors' crimes against enslaved people, not through family stories or historical records, but through direct spiritual contact with the victims of those crimes, who appeared to them in dreams and visions that made the past as real and immediate as the present. This supernatural education ensured that the family's descendants could never claim ignorance about why they were suffering, could never dismiss their misfortunes as random bad luck or natural consequences of poor decisions. They knew with the absolute certainty that comes from direct spiritual revelation that their troubles were the result of cosmic justice being administered for crimes that their bloodline had committed against people who had been powerless to defend themselves through ordinary means. Some of the family's descendants attempted to break the curse through various means, consulting with priests, moving to distant locations, even converting to different religions in hopes of escaping the spiritual forces that pursued them. But the ancestors had crafted their vengeance with too much care and precision to be defeated by such simple measures, and every attempt to escape only seemed to intensify the supernatural attention that followed the bloodline wherever it went. The last direct descendant of Auguste Tibito died in 1923, a broken old man named Antoine, who had spent his entire life tormented by visions of enslaved people who demanded acknowledgement and restitution for crimes committed decades before his birth. His death marked the end of the bloodline and the completion of the spiritual justice that I had set in motion during that terrible autumn of 1856. proving that the ancestors were capable of patience and persistence that exceeded human understanding. As I prepare to join Zara and the others in the realm beyond this world, I feel a satisfaction deeper than anything I experienced during my years in physical form. The curse I placed on the Tibibido family accomplished everything I had hoped it would accomplish and more, demonstrating to the world that there were consequences for treating human beings as property, and that those consequences could not be avoided through wealth, social position, or the passage of time. The old powers that I called upon to deliver justice proved themselves worthy of the trust that my grandmother and her grandmother had placed in them, honoring their ancient compact with those who knew how to approach them with proper respect and genuine need. They had heard my prayer for vengeance and answered it with an enthusiasm that exceeded my wildest expectations, showing that the spiritual forces that govern the universe have their own sense of justice that operates according to laws that transcend human legal systems. I go to my rest knowing that I served my ancestors well, that I honored my daughter's memory appropriately, and that I used the gifts passed down through my bloodline to strike a blow against the system that had oppressed my people for generations. The spirits will remember what I did, just as they remembered what was done to me, and that memory will continue to protect the powerless and punish the cruel for as long as there are people who know how to call upon the old ways for assistance. The voodoo that flows through my veins will not die with me, because I have taught others what my grandmother taught me, and they will teach still others when their time comes to pass on the knowledge that has sustained our people through centuries of suffering and oppression. The spirits are eternal, and their justice is patient but certain, and those who think they can escape consequences for their cruelty by hiding behind laws and customs that favor the powerful will learn, as the Tibido family learned, that there are older laws and deeper powers that cannot be bought, threatened, or ignored. My name is Celeste Tibido, called Iangoy by the spirits who knew me before I was born and who will know me after I die. I was a slave, but I was also a priestess, and I used both identities to serve justice in ways that the courts and laws of men could never achieve. Let my story be remembered as proof that the oppressed are never truly powerless as long as they remember who they are and where they came from, and as long as they understand that some debts can only be paid in blood and spirit, and the kind of supernatural justice that burns across generations like fire through dry grass. This was the story of Celeste Tibido, known as Iangoy, the voodoo priestess of Louisiana. She died of cancer in 1881 in Natchez, Mississippi, where she had established herself as a respected healer and midwife in the freed black community. The Tibido family line ended in 1923 with the death of Antoine Tibido, who died alone and mad in a New Orleans boarding house, claiming until his final breath that he was being haunted by the spirits of slaves his family had owned. Magnolia Bend Plantation was eventually abandoned and reclaimed by the Louisiana swamplands. Local folklore maintains that the ruins are still haunted by the spirits Celeste summoned, and few people are willing to venture onto the property even today. Her spiritual practices were passed down through the women she trained, becoming part of the broader voodoo and hoodoo traditions that continue to thrive in Louisiana and throughout the American South. The ancient powers that Celeste wielded still pulse through the mystic bayous of Louisiana, a testament to the fierce strength of those who refuse to let injustice go unanswered, no matter the cost. If this story of supernatural vengeance and the terrible price of cruelty stirs something primal in your soul, join our community dedicated to preserving these powerful narratives of spiritual resistance. Subscribe to our channel to discover more tales of those who called upon forces beyond this world to balance scales that earthly justice could never weigh. Stories that prove the oppressed are never truly powerless when they remember the old ways and the spirits that guard them. Your support ensures these voices of mystical rebellion continue to whisper their secrets to those brave enough to listen, reminding us that some debts can only be paid in realms where the powerful have no power and the ancestors hold eternal court.